weird, isn't it? Here we go. We're live. Just let it catch up with LinkedIn, and then we'll get going in 10, 15 seconds or so, shall we?
Sounds good.
Okay. People are coming in. Right, let's do it. This is Helen and I's first webinar of the year with Thrive, which we're really excited to share with you all. We hosted loads of these last year, shared lots of valuable tips. We brought customers together and shared lots of insights into the world of learning and what's happening. Today, we're going to focus on some real actionable tips and some trends that we're seeing. Helen's going to share lots of valuable insights from a variety of studies. And we're going to answer the Q&A as well as we work through the session. So as an introduction, my name is Josh Devanny. I'm our Chief Innovation and Growth Officer here at Thrive. So I have the pleasure of working with our product and technology teams to really define our roadmap and where we're heading next as a business to really support our customers. And I'm joined by Helen.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I'm Helen Marshall. I'm Chief Learning Officer. I've been with Thrive for about 3.5 years now. My role is, I suppose, two-pronged. So I keep an ear to the ground on what's going on across the industry and also look after kind of talent development within Thrive as well. I'm really looking forward to the session today, and I'm glad that you've all managed to join us.
Thanks, Helen. So I guess to begin with, we just want to start with two kind of questions that are on the screen. There's lots of challenges for L&D, I think, in how everything's evolving. With the rise of AI in the workplace, there's lots of asks for efficiencies and, how can we use AI to be more efficient? And I think from an L&D perspective, there's more questions than ever before in terms of, are we doing enough? Are we focusing on the right areas? Are we having enough impact in terms of what we're doing? And I think today we want to talk about some of these trends so we can really focus on where L&D should be spending their time to really help prove business impact for the different businesses that you work with. Last year, we spent so much time working with customers. We've got an impact team where our data analysts and award writers work really closely with our customers to prove impact and alignment across the industry. And we saw some brilliant examples of that. We saw Jet2 won lots of awards around social and collaborative learning, specifically within their contact centers and proving things like speed to competence. And we saw the AA win lots of awards around event registrations and saving significant cost there as well. And a bunch of other customers as well, where we're really starting to prove that impact. And for us at Thrive, at least, that begins right at the beginning of every implementation, really wanting to understand what are those business metrics, how can we align our implementations to those metrics, build content strategies that work towards that as well. And all the services and the people and the support that go around that help those customers and L&D teams really prove that more than ever before. And that's something that we're going to really double down on in 2025 to help those customers.
I think it's just really interesting as well, Josh, around across the industry, there's that kind of general sense that L&D aren't really doing enough to the question on screen before. And actually, we hear stories every day, not just from our customers who are obviously having a lot of success, but from teams across the industry who are having that kind of more, I suppose, quietly making progress and heading towards business impact a lot. So it's, there is a real positive story to be told across the industry. And I just really feel like we can double down on that as well as an industry to talk about that success a lot more too.
For sure. And I think on this slide, it's a perfect example of that, right? In terms of, we probably all did lots of things in 2024, some that we don't want to repeat again and we want to move away from. I think lots of L&D teams were probably still doing the things that they know weren't contributing to the impact side of things. But there are probably lots of things that we did do in 2024 that we want to capitalize on and build upon in 2025. So these are just some things for you to think about. Strategic alignment for me is always one of the most important ones, having that support from leadership through to L&D to ensure they're aligned on things like skills, how we want the employee experience to look, what do we want a great onboarding experience to look like, all these types of things. I think another one of there as well is reacting to changing business needs. I know I and Helen spend lots of time with customers where businesses are rapidly changing due to technology, but also other factors. And they need to quickly pivot and change how they're designing programs, delivering things, building online experiences, and be responsive to that. And I think technology plays a part in that because it allows us to move quicker than ever before in terms of quickly pivoting or changing an approach. But it doesn't necessarily always have to be technology as well, which in how we respond to those things. Which for you, Helen, jump out the most on here personally?
Yeah, I think I'm with you, Josh, in terms of strategic alignment for sure. But then kind of doubling down on measuring effectiveness and making sure that what you're measuring then obviously feeds into that broader business landscape and how you're actually proving the value as a team, but also the value you're bringing to the teams you work with as an L&D team across the business. And I think some of that comes down into being able to push back effectively on training requests and actually say, and that links into problem solving too, right? You know, you've got someone comes to you with a problem. It's not necessarily a training solution. So I think we're getting a lot better as L&D teams at doing that. And I think we'll obviously, if we've already had success there, I think doubling down on those kind of things and aligning more broadly to what your business needs and what your business goals are can only lead to you being more effective in the future as well.
Nice. Couldn't agree more. I think that links nicely to the next one, which is a bit of an interactive challenge for everybody online. Thinking back to last year, and then as you set up for 2025, what are some of those biggest organizational challenges at the moment for you? Feel free to pop them into the chat. It could be L&D specific. It might be larger kind of macro challenges that the organizations are facing, which you're having to fix or look at as a result of that. So pop them into the chat if you can, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So whilst you do that and hopefully populate the chat with lots of comments, I'm just going to run through a few industry reports that I think are worth paying attention to at the moment, and then I'll come back to have a look at what you've popped in the chat as well after I've done this. So the first thing I think that's worth calling out is across the industry, every single year there are multiple different reports that often say similar things, but also have contrasting opinions in them as well. And it's really hard to keep on top of everything that's released. So one really useful tool in order to do that is the Offbeat L&D Trends Map. Now, Offbeat pulled together over 30 different industry reports and put them in this neat little diagram that you can see. I mean, it's just a circle on screen. You obviously aren't supposed to be able to read what's on there, but you can get a good sense of some of those challenges and solutions that are available to teams at the moment. And it provides that kind of holistic look at what's going on now, what's going on in maybe going to be happening in a few years' time, and then ultimately what's going to be happening in 20 plus years' time that we need to pay attention to. What this is really good at doing is identifying those core big standout trends. Now, on the left-hand side of the screen, obviously you can see what those trends are. I don't think there's anything on here that would surprise you. It's that intersection of human and tech, how AI comes into play, skills-based organizations, and learning from both an organizational and individual level. So I think that is probably all as we would all expect. That's what we've been speaking about and contributing to for the past at least 12 months, if not longer. But what's really interesting, I think, is when you start to dig into some of these areas is actually largely when you're accumulating all this information, what appears on the map that you can explore and it's interactive are actually solutions rather than problems that organizations are facing. So actually there's a good view of how people are approaching things from a solution perspective, but actually it's not really that useful in telling us actually what are those challenges and what's going on in your business that we really need to kind of pay attention to and think about. So if we reframed that and thought about what the problems are that would fall underneath those trends, it suddenly becomes a very different picture when you've got that, what are those challenges right now that businesses are facing, what's happening in 2 to 5 years time, and then thinking ahead, are those challenges going to be the same in 20 years time as they are right now? We don't know the answer to that, I suppose, but it would be interesting to reframe it in that way. So when you start to think about, if we're thinking about human AI synergy, one of the problems that you might be facing there might be there's a lot of repetitive and time consuming tasks that is actually reducing overall productivity, or you actually have a really poor view of what's going on across your workforce as well. And that becomes a real problem in itself. And then ultimately your competitive advantage diminishes as a result of that, because there's a resistance to change in your organization. So as you start to think about those, and obviously we'll come back to what you've all populated in the chat as well, you get a very different picture of what's going on across the organization. So I'd say that's one of the limitations of this, but it's also a very useful tool just to get that sense check of what's going on now and what might be happening in the future. So I'll come back to what you've said in the chat there, and I can see there's a few things that are coming up. Obviously, there's a few things that we've highlighted on screen here that we know are organizational challenges based on some of the things our customers experience, based on our understanding of what we're hearing across the industry, but also some of the communities that we're part of as well. I can see that a few of those things are the same as what people have said in the chat. Josh, I don't know if there's anything standing out to you in what people have said whilst I've been talking.
Yeah, there's some like standout ones. I mean, Sally said there, upskilling our people with AI and digital learning. Like we're actually talking about that a lot internally at the minute in terms of how do we enable people to use LLMs like ChatGPT or others. How do you prompt them in the right way, and how do you interact with them? Lots of these tools have kind of sprung upon us, right? But the workforce aren't necessarily equipped in how to use them in the best way. So that's definitely a theme that we're seeing a lot. I think as well, Adam, hi Adam, you've said demand versus capacity of the L&D team. Again, in a lot of organizations that we're speaking to at the minute, there is a demand to do more with less. And there's still a lot of demand to build experiences, do programs, but the capacity isn't always there. So again, how do we use technology in most cases to create more efficiencies in the lack of having capacity from there?
It's definitely been a challenge over, I guess, the past year, and I think it's probably going to continue into this year. Is that kind of reducing resource, a headcount, budget, and like you say, Josh, there's a really interesting tension there between actually, yes, there might be reduced headcount, but then how can we utilize new technology to help us in that situation as an L&D team? So it'll be interesting to see what happens over the course of the next 12 months for sure.
Also Scott as well. Hi, Scott. Has mentioned they're creating a technical competency framework and a skills taxonomy. I think there was such a rush last year and the year before around skills and upskilling, reskilling. How do we build taxonomies? How do we build talent marketplaces and these types of solutions? I think still a lot of organizations aren't necessarily there. You don't meet many organizations that have full-blown skills taxonomies defined, job role. Even the larger organizations that we meet, it's still not there. So again, that's definitely a big challenge for a lot of L&D teams that we speak with at the minute.
And then I suppose zooming out kind of to think about what's going on in the environments that we're part of as well. I think the geopolitical landscape is really interesting at the moment, because there's so much going on in the world that affects everything that we do essentially. So I think there's some real challenges that we might start to see coming through organizations as the year goes on as well. So thank you all for sharing. I think that's really useful, and obviously there's a lot that resonates with what we're hearing as well as what you're saying in the chat there. I think it's worth pulling up Don Taylor's global sentiment survey here, because I think it's still open now for this year. So the results of this survey normally get released in about February. So I think there's probably maybe just a week left to actually submit your answers if you haven't done that already. This gives a really kind of hot take on what L&D teams think is going to be important in the coming year. So I just thought, before we dig into what we're going to talk about this year, let's take a look back, see what was happening at this point last year, and see how that might have lifted or might have shifted. What's really interesting to me in this is that we're about to talk about some of the stuff that's come up in the chat there around skills, personalization, automation, how you leverage AI. And actually, when you're looking at the sentiment survey, skills, or obviously AI is right at the top of the list, which was as expected, but that kind of personalization, adaptive delivery, those automation elements and skills are right at the top of this list. So what that says to me is actually, yes, this was useful in saying, well, we think this is going to be these are hot topics over the course of 2024, but actually really we're probably only just starting to see the kind of the fruits of that thinking coming through now, 12 to 18 months later. So when this survey is released next month, How will these things have shifted? Will AI still be at the top? Are skills still going to be important to people? I don't really think there's going to be too much change at the top of the table. But I think it's just worth reflecting on that in terms of where we were and where we might be when this is released next month as well. Another watch out with this one is that you can't quite distinguish between problems and solutions again in this list. So there are some things like proving value, which could be classed as a problem for L&D teams, when you've got things like micro learning on this list as well, which is clearly a solution to a certain problem that you might be having in your team as well. So it's not as black and white as it might seem, but I think it's always useful to know what's important and what's top of mind to people as we begin the year. And then lastly, I just wanted to call out Don Taylor and Egla Vinashkaite's report, AI from Talk to Action, where they highlighted, I think they ran a webinar on this, where they highlighted the AI in L&D complexity scale. Now, they actually called this I think it was L&D's immaturity model when it comes to AI. So what they were saying there is that actually a lot of L&D teams are really focused in on how they can leverage AI from an administrative point of view, from a learning, design, and content point of view. But quite often teams were unable to leverage AI to prove impact against things like personalization, skills practice, skills management, all of that kind of good stuff, which, as you can see on the screen, requires more kind of sophisticated thinking and application of AI. Now, what's really interesting, I think, is that as this year goes on, my prediction, and Josh, jump in if you think similarly, is that line on the right-hand side is actually going to go up as teams understand how they can leverage technology in order to have an impact on things like skills practice within an organization. Is that your understanding as well, Josh?
I'd say so. It's already starting to creep up a little bit already, I think. From like 6 months or even 12 months ago to now, when we speak to our customers, they've already started to level up the sophistication around lots of those themes. I think there's been a real good approach to trying things and testing things in L&D when we speak to customers, just like failing fast, experimenting with different tools to address some of these challenges. And that's definitely starting to increase it, I'd say.
Yeah, I think so. And I think what will be really interesting to see is that kind of the efficiency focus switch towards business performance. And I'll come back to talk a little bit about that at the end as well, and how that kind of translation of what's going on in AI is actually, I suppose, translatable to what L&D teams need to be focused on more broadly as well. But that's the scene setting done for you in terms of what's going on in the industry. And I'll pass over to Josh now to kind of dig into what those focus areas are for the coming year.
Yes, some of those big challenges, engagement, performance, and then evolving the business needs are definitely still in play. And the trends that we see in 2025, personalization, unsurprisingly, skill alignment, which links back to some of the comments in the chat, like Scott said, around building skills, ontologies and taxonomies. And then lastly, automation. And I think with all of these trends and challenges, we've got to ask the question, how can AI support us in these, right? Here at Thrive, for example, we've got a dedicated AI team now, and there's different approaches to AI, right? Lots of vendors are just plugging in LLMs, Gemini, ChatGPT, Bedrock, Anthropic, whatever it might be, and integrating that with a product, which is great. Other LMS, LXP providers are building out their own models and doing all sorts of interesting things. I think for us, at least, with the trends from a personalization perspective, there's a big focus on adaptive learning and truly adapting the platform to present content to people at the right time based on skill, behavior, and after doing some level of diagnostic or knowledge checks to really personalize that experience. I think with skill alignment as well, AI has definitely got a huge part to play in that, in terms of not only defining skills and automating the skills which people have presented, but also mapping content to skills as well. I think a lot of platforms, not necessarily, the content isn't always necessarily displayed to the user based on the correct skill or level. And I think, again, AI is definitely going to help that. And then automation is probably one of the most interesting ones for me. I think there's automation on the learner side for sure, but how can we use AI in context of automation for L&D teams? So some of the things that we're thinking about now and that we're trialing with customers is AI assistance, but for L&D teams. So treat this as a co-pilot that can sit alongside L&D teams to say, hey, build me this campaign, or run me this report, or design me a program on this, or what content should be included in this pathway for this audience based upon the data that we've seen. And I think those types of things would really start to drive automation, and link to some of the comments in the chat from like Adam, for example, where demand versus capacity isn't really there anymore. We don't have big enough teams. So how can we use assistants and co-pilots to really create more automation and therefore efficiency is going to be really interesting for me. And then I think once we've started to address those trends, all of those challenges should get easier in many ways. You know, if we can create more personalization, does that drive better engagement? You'd think so. So that's probably where we're heading on that. And I think when we look at this box that Helen's just brought up on the screen, everything's starting to evolve quite nicely. Some of our customers are super sophisticated, and even non-customers that I've met who are using lots of different LMSs, LXPs, and different solutions at events last year are doing some really interesting things around performance support, you know, really presenting learning to people in the moment of need, rather than just sending people to an LMS. It's actually saying, let's integrate the content where people spend their time more, from a search perspective. But I think for many L&D teams now, it's starting at these kind of the left-hand side of the chart and starting to test the water. I think that the learning design and content, there's so much we can do there now in terms of production of content, designing content quicker than ever before. I think that's going to really change the whole instructional design process moving forward. From your perspective, Helen, I know you're speaking to so many L&D members on a regular basis. What are you seeing the most in terms of this box being tested or tried with from L&D perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is skills, how you can leverage AI to get a better understanding of what's going on across your organization, whether that then leads into kind of talent mobility, or your organization understanding its skills gaps and being able to, I suppose, move talent around to that point around talent mobility, or know where it needs to hire external people in order to meet the demands that fall in line with its ultimately what the business is trying to achieve. So that's where it becomes really exciting for me. I think, like, not that the administrative tasks and the learning content design stuff isn't exciting, because this is huge potential there for teams. What I'm still seeing across the communities I'm part of is that there's still a lot of exploration being done on that side of the graph. And there's still a lot of people that are only just starting to get to grips with that. But they're doing it in a way that's thinking, well, I can do this now in order to free up my time to do this more complex work that is now not as complex as it was previously. And I had a really good chat with someone the other day who's using Skill GPT, and it's completely changed the way that they have approached skills across their business. And he started rolling out projects in one place, and now the rest of the business, like, I want to do that as well. And I think that's how it happens with those like slow drip feeding changes a lot of the time, to get people kind of comfortable with taking the risk. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. So yeah, some really interesting things starting to happen there for sure.
And I think in 2025, contrary to what you might see on LinkedIn or other vendors, learning systems will remain essential, right? There's lots of talk of the LMS is dead, or the LMS is going away, or learning systems are going to go away. We've seen this for the last 5, 10, 15 years. People have been saying it for ages, right? But a learning system will remain essential to deliver training at scale. I think, of course, you can do lots of interesting integrations and integrate learning where people spend a lot of time, which is great, but you still need that system of record. You still need a place to store and organize all of that knowledge in a central place and make it easy for people to get to with a slick user experience. Does it need to evolve? Absolutely. And does it need to become more intelligent? 100%. And I think the only way to do that, really, to offer a really personalized experience, is through that learning system. So I think with the growth of adaptive AI to really present learning to people how it should be based on skill, behavior, assessment, etc., is super important. So I definitely don't think the LMS is going away anytime soon, contrary to what people think.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, isn't it? I think it's when people say that, obviously there's a clickbait element in there somewhere, but also I think some people do genuinely think that overnight, next week, all learning systems will just disappear and there'll be a whole new user experience in their place. And realistically, things just don't happen that quickly not just in L&D, just in general within business. So there's going to be a definite shift in the way that you interact and encounter learning systems. And to your point, Josh, we do need an overhaul of how that happens and how we can make that more effective for people. But yeah, it doesn't mean that the LMS is going to just disappear overnight. So I think we just have to take stuff like that with a pinch of salt sometimes. And I suppose to your point, Josh, around that kind of what the personalization can do, it's shifting that perception from I just need to recall the knowledge that's stored somewhere to actually how do you showcase that application of skills and that application of behaviors. And I think there's probably some quite exciting stuff that you're thinking about in this regard that will really kind of excite people.
Yeah, I think like we've seen obviously assessments in a lot of different systems, and it's multifaceted in terms of how that's approached. But there's so many different ways in which we can do knowledge testing now at scale. We've seen some really interesting technologies recently, things like video role play, right? Where let's say, Helen, I could submit a video to you as my coach and you could provide feedback. But before you actually even go through that video, the AI has provided recommendations based on things I've said, body language, mannerisms, tone of voice, all these types of things, to really help the coach or the manager provide feedback quicker, because we know that's quite a long process, right, in terms of when you're providing coaching and feedback to people. So we want to see, how can we assess in different ways to really, again, create more efficiencies. Because if you're rolling out assessments across tens and tens of thousands of people or thousands of people, there needs to be quicker ways to do that. So we believe that AI or things like video coaching can definitely play a big role in 2025. Also, the whole verification of skills as well. Like there's lots of different ways in which you can verify a skill. And there's lots of great platforms that are doing that already. So it's about how do we kind of integrate with those types of solutions, as well as things like badging and credentials and stuff. There's things like that happening, and some really interesting things happening on the horizon around that as well, which is going to help with that personalization piece. And I think once people have gone through assessment and knowledge recall and the application of behaviors, then it's starting to think about how do we actually visualize that for the business and for the L&D team, and what does that look like from a data and analytics perspective. Most platforms right now aren't really built or designed to track and measure that type of behavior change. So we want to start to think about, how does analytics and data change in light of capturing people's behaviors in different ways.
That's the part that really excites me, is like having that kind of bigger picture view of what's going on, and those experiences are personalized to the individual, but then you can get that broader view of what's going on across your business. I just think it's a really exciting prospect.
And it is that kind of connecting it back to skills, right? In terms of, what are the skills needed for the organization? How can we visualize those skills in a more meaningful way? How within data dashboards, how can we also start to pull in non-learning data and start to correlate that against the people who've gone through experiences? So if it is a sales program, how do we actually have all of the data in there from a learning perspective, all the assessment results, the submissions of evidence, but then correlate that against sales data from stores or whatever environment they're in, to see if actually the application of what they've been doing has had a tangible result on the business metrics. So I think that's something that I'm really excited. I know our customers will be as well, because that goes back to the beginning of the session, right? In terms of how do we kind of prove impact for L&D teams and organizations, because we know they need to kind of be driving more ROI moving forward.
And that's where that curve starts to go back. It starts to go up on the right-hand side as well, as you start to utilize AI in order to do that too.
Nice. I guess kind of touched on that then, kind of repeating myself. In terms of that, connecting the skills back, right? Have you got any more thoughts on that, Helen, in terms of skills, connecting it to the business results and measuring everything?
Yeah, well, I think that is probably one of the hardest things for teams to think about, is when I'm talking about skills, how is that skill actually impacting what the business needs to do? And I think it's that kind of leap from actually something that is quite specific and potentially technical sometimes, to actually how is this important to what we're trying to achieve as a business. And I think sometimes that leap hasn't been made as an effective way as it could have been. So I think like being able to think about that, and to your point around how you map that across different data points and bring that whole story together, is really where it'll start to kind of link back into something that's a bit more tangible for the business. And then you become, your whole kind of skills outlook becomes much more aligned to what your, not only what your employees need from a career progression perspective, but what you need as a business in order to be successful right now, but also in the future as well. So yeah, that it all just comes back to quite a holistic experience at the end of the day, once you start to personalize those experiences. And once you start to then connect the dots across the business, you can then kind of see how that line kind of develops, and you can link everything in together essentially. So yeah, it's a really exciting time, I think, from a skills perspective. Lots going on that's worth paying attention to.
For sure. And then automation, which we touched on earlier. We need to revolutionize the way we deliver learning, and the more than we administer it. And I think from this perspective, it is about, for me at least, it's about how do we do this from the L&D perspective. So how do we give tools to the L&D team so they can create more automation from, let's build a campaign and release it here. How do we set up automated nudges out to learners based on different interaction points? Let's say they're on a 6-week program and they have a pathway and there's an event to attend, but there's some learning here. How do we nudge them at the right time to get them back into the platform? I think those kind of nudges, not just an email notification or a push notification on a mobile app, but a notification to Teams or Slack or wherever those communication tools might be, if they're all really automated based on data, we can ensure that we've got a higher chance of engaging them, because we know there's so much noise, spam notifications, etc. Now we need to be data driven in terms of how those nudges are deployed. And I think as well, from a learning design perspective, when it comes to automation, how do we prompt assistants, learning assistants, to say, hey, build me a program on X? That might do 60, 70, 80% of the work. And then the L&D teams can bring in their expertise and specialisms to actually design the right program. So I think automation for me in 2025, the L&D teams will come in the form of co-pilots and assistants that sit alongside the L&D team to create more efficiencies. So they're not having to do too much administration. They can get back to the actual thing that they're doing, which might be performance on consulting or building programs or running events and these types of things. That would be personalization for me at scale, if you like.
Yeah, I think once you're able to kind of take off some of that workload from an administration perspective as well, from utilizing automation to do that, and then think about how you can automate some of those learning design and delivery elements as well, it becomes then much easier to think about what that experience is going to look like ultimately. And I think, to your point, Josh, if we're thinking about how you can create an experience and maybe AI can help you get 70 or 80% of the way there, actually, if it's also doing that, but in a way that a learning designer would think about how you design training to be effective in the first place, that's when it becomes even more exciting, I think, in that it's doing it in an educated way, I suppose. Whereas previously, if you're just kind of asking ChatGPT to create you a resource on XYZ, it's only delivering text to you. It's not saying this might be best delivered in this way. And so that's, I think there's going to be a really positive impact for L&D teams, particularly to our point right at the beginning, if they're really up against it in terms of budget and resource in the year ahead as well.
For sure.
So I think on that point, thinking about how that all joins together and how you can start thinking about that broader picture and the tangible impact that you're having on your business, I think it's worth coming back to Laura Overton's L&D value spectrum, where a lot of the time in her research, she's found L&D teams who are really just focused on those kind of content outcomes. So engagement metrics, efficiency focus, CSAT scores, NPS, things like that are useful gauges of initial engagement towards how you actually start thinking about the value that's placed on business outcomes. So things like talent mobility, things like time to competency, and how they feed into how you create and embed a learning culture ultimately at the end of the day as well. So there's that real shift from actually we need some of these engagement things over here to actually we're really having an impact on how our people are able to do their best work and how the business achieves what it needs to achieve as well. And I think in Laura's research, there was 90% of the teams that she'd been working with previously were really focused on those content outcomes. So it was really about shifting towards the other side of the scale. But to my point right at the beginning, when we're thinking about AI in particular, it's a very similar picture at the moment. So we're very much focused over on the left-hand side, thinking about content outcomes and efficiencies. And then how, as we start to become more familiar and comfortable with AI, do we then start to shift to those skills ideas, those performance outcomes? And so these two correlate really nicely for me in terms of where L&D in general is headed in the future. So I just ask you to, everyone in the who's live on the webinar, to just spend a moment reflecting on how do you actually want to spend your time? Where do you want to have that split across content outcomes, business outcomes, and ultimately cultural outcomes? Or another way of thinking about this is how are you currently splitting your time, and is that the way that you want it to be in the future? Because I think a lot of the time people might answer with, well, actually, I have 80% of my focus is on content outcomes, and that's, if you think about it, that's not really enough to prove my value as a team or against what the business is trying to achieve and what those outcomes are. So I just spend a little bit of time reflecting on that and think about where you want to get to over the course of 2025. And to leave you just with a final quote, we've got some metrics that you can use to measure there as well, which I think it's always useful thinking about, well, if you are focused on those content outcomes, because in order to do that, to create that certain level of engagement, in order to make sure people are bought into what you want to achieve, you can start measuring things like views and completions and CSATs and all that kind of good stuff, as long as you then start to look at what those metrics might be from a business perspective. So there's some examples on screen here that you might want to measure as well, like reduced attrition or increased tenure, or verbatim feedback, more qualitative data as well when you're thinking about those cultural outcomes. So what data points are you going to pick for your year ahead as well? So all good stuff that's worth thinking about. And just to wrap it up, I think this quote is really timely. So thinking about the ability to learn faster than your competitors may be the only sustainable competitive advantage that you have. So ultimately, how do you allow people the time and space to learn in order to outpace your competitors at the end of the day? So we'll leave you with all of that. I know we've probably covered quite a lot. If you have any questions, please pop them in the chat. Obviously, we've got a little bit of time left to run through your questions and answers, but I can see that there's been actually quite a few comments in the chat whilst I've been talking, so I might just have a quick gander at those. I don't know, Josh, whether you've picked up on any while I've been talking.
There's been a few. There's Craig. Hi, Craig. Saying it can be really confusing when you've procured a number of learning AI tools that do similar things. I think there's a lot of that at the minute, especially in decentralized organizations, or whereby the teams have gone out and bought lots of different tools that might do the same thing. I think experimenting, running pilots, running POCs, validating not only the solutions, but validating the use case is super important. So we're seeing more and more of that for sure. We'd always recommend that. Matt Smith, aligning L&D to business data, not just L&D to, is very salient to us right now. I think that's something that a lot of organizations are striving for, isn't it? Like, how do we pull both together to see actually what's happening, rather than just looking at those L&D metrics?
Yeah, and that was, I guess, to your point, Josh, about like how do you bring in all those different data points in order to create that much more holistic experience and view of what's going on within a business, and how L&D can be the kind of the one that brings that all together and tells that story and is able to showcase that kind of impact for their people, I think is really interesting. So yeah, thanks, Matt, for that comment. I can see Becky down there as well, that wants to spend all of her time in business and cultural, and that doesn't surprise me, Becky, and it's music to our ears, of course. And I think it's, really, really good to see that, that is probably where the future is headed, that at some point maybe we won't even be talking about those kind of content outcomes. It's just, how does this content affect a business outcome ultimately? And that's where we might end up as well. So I can't see any questions coming through at the moment, but obviously we'll hang on just a few minutes in case any do crop up. But it's such a fascinating topic, and I think whenever we run this webinar, it's always useful to kind of take a look back at what the past year has told us. And so things change so fast across the course of 12 months. So when we do this again next year, it'll be really interesting to see what that kind of landscape looks like, and think about what's changed and what business impact or cultural impact people might have had as well. So I'm happy to leave it there. Josh, if you are, I can't see any questions coming through on the chat. So thank you. Obviously, if anyone does have any questions, feel free to reach out to Josh or myself on LinkedIn, or any other way you might be able to get in touch with us if you already have our contact details, or just leave a comment on the LinkedIn chat after you leave as well. But thank you all for joining, and thank you, Josh, for delivering this alongside me, and hopefully catch you all soon.
Thanks, Helen. See you all soon. Bye-bye.